Welcome to Hustle and Flow with Heather Hubbard, episode number 29. Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard, and I was a litigator, partner, and practice group leader at an AmLaw 200 firm. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your personal life. So how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you embrace your ambition without selling your soul? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back. I am your host, Heather Hubbard. So when this comes out, I'm going to be on vacation. And I have been working some really long hours recently. And you know from my meditation challenge that I've been struggling with my stress recently. So I am completely unplugging for my vacation. I'm going to take my email off of my phone. So I'm a little scared. I'm not going to lie. But you guys know how important I think vacations are and how important it is to completely unplug. And so if you want to know my thoughts on this, you can go back to episode 8 called Working Vacations. And I share one, why I think it's so important to truly take a vacation where you unplug, and 2, the steps you need to take in order to prepare so that you can do that. So for me, one of the things that I did to prepare was I'm recording podcasts in advance. I'm recording them now so that they can be released while I'm gone. I've prepared emails in advance that my assistant will send out, and he's going to be monitoring my email and helping me out there. So you really have to just think ahead. But so while we're on the topic of stress, while we're on the topic of vacations and planning for vacations, I thought now is the perfect time to bring in my very first interview. So I've always really just talked. It's kind of been a solo podcast, but today I am going to introduce to you Kara Loewentheil. She is a lawyer turned life coach, and she has her own podcast, The Lawyer Stress Solution. You can also find her at redesignyourmind.com. And we are talking today about the lawyer brain, how your thoughts really drive everything, and how you can begin to reduce your stress and anxiety by following some of Kara's tools and tips. So I know I have a lot of questions for her. We're going to be talking about procrastination, and I cannot wait to jump in. So with that, let's go to the interview. Kara Loewentheil, thank you so much for joining me today on the Hustle and Flow podcast.
Thanks for having me, Heather. I'm excited to be here.
So you are the very first person I have interviewed, and I can't wait. I'm so excited.
I feel very special now.
All right. So let's jump right in. Tell me how you went from being a lawyer to a life coach.
Yeah, that is the question everyone wants to know, including my parents for sure. I was a kind of stressed out, miserable lawyer, like a lot of my clients and potentially some of the listeners of this podcast too. And I've always been interested in self-help and psychology. When I was in college, I actually was going to major in psychology. And then, like so many people, I ended up in law school. But I'd always kept that interest, and I, always read up and tried to stay current. And as I was trying to work my way through my legal career and feeling like I kept kind of getting these brass rings and gold stars and getting prestigious clerkships and fellowships and everything, and yet I still didn't feel good about myself or my life, I started kind of studying more consciously self-help and psychology and cognitive science. And I worked with a couple of coaches myself. And in the end, I felt like I had kind of stumbled upon and also created this really particular format for lawyers, and understanding my own lawyer brain just made me think, there's so many other lawyers out there who need help dealing with their stress and anxiety and creating the careers and lives they want. And I just started to feel like that was really the unique contribution I could make to the world. Like I was a totally good lawyer, but that there were other people who could do that job, but that nobody else was doing what I wanted to do for lawyers in their kind of mental lives. So that's the story.
I love it. Well, so when I was in my law firm, I was introduced to, I guess, what we're calling the lawyer brain by Dr. Larry Richard. And he works with large law firms, but I always thought how crazy that he's just working with a few leaders. Like someone needs to come out and help everyone, right? Like from a bigger audience and helping associates and everyone. So I love that you have come in and you are it's a fresh take and it's so relevant. And so I love that you are helping so many people because, and like, I want to go ahead and give you this heads up, guys. I mentioned it in the intro, but Kara has her own podcast and it's called The Lawyer Stress Solution. And if you have not been listening, if you have not subscribed, you need to do so now because it's basically free advice and you're going to learn about this stuff every single week. All right. So let's talk about the lawyer brain because I talk about it here on my podcast, but we may be using different terms. So I want to make sure that my listeners fully understand what you mean by the lawyer brain.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'm not super familiar with Larry Richard's work, so I don't know if that's what he means by the lawyer brain either. What I mean by the lawyer brain is that as you go through law school and as you practice as a lawyer, you are taught to think in specific ways. And I think there's a lot of recognition that like lawyers think a little bit differently. But what I do is break it down into a couple of main kind of thought patterns or frameworks that lawyers learn to use that are pretty damaging if they're not controlled and managed. So the major ones for me that I work with on clients are catastrophizing. So always thinking about the worst case scenario and the worst possible outcome. You're really taught to do that and it's valued as a lawyer and it is helpful as a lawyer. But if you don't know how to turn it off, then you're doing it all the time in the rest of your life.
Yep.
So catastrophizing and adversarial orientation. We talk a lot, I think, about how lawyers are argumentative, right? It's sort of painted as though it's I know. Who ever heard of such a thing? I definitely, growing up in a family of 4 lawyers in my household, no one ever argued.
Oh, wow.
And it's sort of painted as like this negative personality trait. It's really just a way of thinking, and it goes so much deeper than we even realize. Lawyers, I don't think we understand how much we've internalized the idea that whenever anyone says anything, the first thing we should do is think about whether they're right or wrong and how to like interrogate it. And then I also see a lot of what I call trouble spotting, which is like always scanning to see what might be wrong, what might be out of place. It's almost like thinking like a paranoid person. So those are, I cannot get into all of lawyer brain, but those are the 3 main components that I see. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about lawyer brain. It's the way of being trained to think like a lawyer that ends up infecting your whole life and creates so much anxiety and stress for people.
Yes, I love it. So I definitely suffer from lawyer brain and I have been actively working on trying to combat it. But it sounds like you're saying there is hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still have a little bit of lawyer brain, right? It's a process. But yes, the truth is you're trained to think like a lawyer. You can be trained not to think like one. Or rather, what I tell my clients is you can train yourself to turn it on and off. Obviously, if you still want to be a lawyer, you need to know how to think about what might go wrong in a contract, right? That's useful. But not knowing how to turn it on and off is really the problem because then your whole life becomes like that. So yes, there's absolutely hope. That's what coaching is for, in my opinion.
So let me ask you, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to the neuroscience and I read up on it, but I'm not trained at all. Mm-hmm. So I always raise the question of, is it nature or is it nurture? Mm-hmm. Is there a specific kind of person that's drawn to the law to begin with? Or do we show up to law school, perfectly, maybe not normal, but, a lot more normal. And then we are trained, like you're saying, with the nurture part, we are then nurtured to have these crazy thoughts. Mm-hmm. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I think that it's both, but I tend more towards nurture. I also think it's interesting that a lot of lawyers come from families where there are other lawyers. And so the part that we think of as nature, before you get to law school, maybe a lot of people are already picking this up just from their family life. So that's actually nurture too, right? So, for me, by the time you get to be old enough to go to law school, I think it's who can even tell at that point what was nature and what was nurture? I do think there are probably people born who are more wired to be a little bit predisposed to anxiety. But I come down mostly on nurture because I've worked with clients who have, had psychiatrists for years and been on medication and have diagnoses of generalized anxiety disorder. And learning the coaching work really changes a lot for them. So, I mostly come down on nurture, although I think the most important question to me is well, let's see, how far can we take you, right? Maybe no one's going to get to 100% enlightenment. None of us are the Buddha. But I think you can change a lot, and who can really say where it starts?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I will say, I always try to throw this out there occasionally because, I have been to therapy, I have been on medication, and there is nothing wrong with that. I highly encourage people to get what they need. But I personally found the most progress and the most relief when I started learning about the tools from a coaching perspective on basically how to have some perspective and start reframing your thoughts, being aware of your thoughts and realizing that, they are just thoughts. They're not you. So I love what you're doing, Kara. It made a huge difference in my life when I learned about, obviously I've not coached with you, but you were talking exactly about the things that help change my life and reduce my stress. So I 100% endorse what you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. And I often say coaching is for when you're basically functional, right? Yes. Like if you are sort of mentally disorganized to the state that you cannot do this kind of work, then absolutely therapy, medication, inpatient, whatever you need, right? To get you to a place where you have the wherewithal to start working with your thoughts.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about thoughts. Yeah. And I'm trying to think, we can get pretty basic, but that really is where it starts, right? Is having an awareness of your thoughts, because I do want to get into procrastination, but do you want to lay any groundwork for being aware of your thoughts? Or, I was listening to your first podcast and you were talking about, was it the turtle?
Yeah, the turtle on its back. That's what my brain does.
Yes. So I'm just going to kind of if that's okay, I would love to just kind of open up the dialogue for you to kind of, educate my listeners on the basics of how you even get started on this work.
Yeah, totally. So the premise of everything I do is that your thoughts create your feelings and that your feelings are what drive your actions. And then your actions produce the results you have in your life. So if you think of it as a flow chart, there's an external circumstance that happens. It's totally neutral. So I'm going to walk through an example because I think that'll make it easier to understand. Perfect. Let's say an email lands in your inbox. That is an external circumstance that definitely happened. Email is in the inbox. We would have the IT records to prove it. It's real. Now, most of us are taught, I feel anxious when I see this email from the partner on my case. Now, we're taught that email caused my anxiety. If I ask you why you're anxious, you'll say, because I got this email from this partner. And what I teach and what I think is the radical insight of coaching is that's not why you're anxious. You had a thought about the email that produced your anxiety. Mm-hmm. Your anxiety is a physical experience in your body. It's a feeling. It's a sensation in your physical body, like your heart races and you might get hot or you might get clammy or your jaw might get tight. Different people have different sensations. But that what's happening when you have a feeling of anxiety is that you are having a physical reaction in your body to the thought in your mind. And so the thought might have been something like, oh God, that partner always wants me to work late and I had plans tonight. Oh God, they're probably disappointed. I haven't gotten them the brief on time. Oh God, those might be edits on the brief and I bet I failed, right? You have a negative thought about yourself, which generally, in my experience with lawyers, tends to be a version of, I'm not good enough, I'm failing, I did it badly, they're going to be disappointed. Those are kind of the main four. So you have that external circumstance happens, email comes in, you have a thought, oh God, I screwed this up again. Then you feel anxious. So that is really the core insight. And then the second half of it is that your feelings produce your actions. So when you feel anxious, for instance, you often avoid. So it's like the email comes in and then you're like, oh, I don't want to read it. Right. And you get on Facebook or you go get a snack or you go complain to your work buddy about that partner. So the action you take is to avoid it because you're feeling anxious. And then of course the result you have is often negative. So if your thought is I'm taking too long and they want to know where the brief is, and then you feel anxious, and then you go get on Facebook, well, now what happens? Now you're taking even longer, right? So yeah. That's a lot to teach at once, but that is the basic kind of premise that I use.
So to recap, it's the thoughts create the feelings and the feelings create the action.
Yeah, your feelings are what drive your action. If you've ever been like, I don't know why I did that thing, right? It's because you had a feeling that motivated that action, and you had that feeling because of a thought you had.
So we have to be aware of our thoughts if we're going to work on how it eventually impacts the action.
Right. This is why a lot of action changing and habit changing doesn't work, because you're just trying to force yourself to change an action and you're not understanding why you took the action in the first place. Right. So it's like you can install a software that'll block off Facebook. That might help a little bit. But if you're really motivated to avoid, you'll find some other way to avoid. This is right. If that worked, I wouldn't have a business. The way to really stop procrastinating and stop avoiding is to learn how to become aware of what you're thinking and then to change those thoughts Installing software is not going to solve your problem.
Right. Okay. So let's jump in a little bit more. Let's dig deeper with procrastination.
Mm-hmm.
I have never covered this topic. And, I do tell people if you say you work better under a deadline, I'm calling BS on that. So one of the things that we have talked about before on this podcast a few different times is the priority matrix. And I think it was episode 3. We did Take Back Your Day. And we talked about the concept of how most attorneys spend their time doing what they call firefighting. So they're focusing on things that their clients and others tell them are urgent, but they're not really. They're not important. And then they don't have any time to focus on the things that are important but not urgent. And so I have always said you just need to plan ahead. But after listening to your podcast episode, I think that you probably have some great insight on how you don't just need to plan, but there's some things that you can do to help retrain your lawyer brain to help actually get things done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those two tools in conjunction, right, is what would be really powerful. So you can make your matrix, and for some people that works great. And then I imagine some people make the matrix and then they keep saying to themselves, I don't know why I'm not using my matrix, right? Stuff keeps coming up. I don't know. Heather taught me this great thing. And then usually where our brains go is like, there must be something wrong with me, right? Like Heather taught me this great thing and I'm not doing it. God, I'm a failure at this, like everything else. But the reason you're not using your matrix is the thoughts you're having. So, for instance, if you have a belief that if I don't respond to my clients right away, they're going to take their business elsewhere, like that might be an unconscious thought you have. It's going to be very hard to fight that and like focus on the part 1 of the matrix when something comes in, right? Because even though you have all the best intentions, when that email comes in, you unconsciously think, if I don't keep this client happy, they're going to leave the firm and then my career is going to suffer. That's so much anxiety to try to fight through to get back to quadrant 1, right? Your brain is telling you that like it's your survival now. You got to answer this email. So I'm all for planning, and I actually love the matrix, which I haven't used before. I'm totally going to start using part of it. But what I do with my clients is I'm like, let's make a plan for your week. Like 100% knowing that they're going to come back and be like, I didn't do any of that. Right? Because that's how we find out what you're thinking, right? That's how we bring it up. Okay, why didn't you do the thing you said you would do on Monday? Oh, well, I got this email from one of the other partners in the firm, and he really thinks we need to get this business, and so I did this thing, right? Or, oh, well, my kid was sick, and I was just thinking about that all the time, even though it's just the flu. Like, it brings up all the thoughts that are causing the lack of focus and productivity.
Let's say that, because I think every attorney suffers from that. So let's say the email comes in, the call comes in from a client. And even if I'm using my matrix and maybe I know, or maybe I don't, maybe it's subconscious, that maybe I shouldn't be there, because what's really driving me is I have this thought that if I don't respond immediately, my client is going to fire me. What do we do about that?
Yeah, so that's where we get into changing your thoughts, right? Which is really where the magic starts happening. So awareness is the first step, right? Just understanding, oh, why am I getting off my plan right now? And then that's what I really work with people on is how do you change your thoughts? So what you really have to do is, if you're going to do this on your own, what I recommend is you sort of practice brainstorming. What are some other things that I could possibly think in this situation? It's good to often start with the opposite. Like, okay, my thought is the client is going to leave if I don't answer this email. Now, is that really true? Do I know that that's true? Is it possible the client wouldn't leave if I don't answer this email right away? Have I had other clients where I didn't answer an email right away and they didn't leave, right? So sort of talking through, like, is that really rational? And then on another level, like, do you want to have clients who you have to respond that way to, right? If you're getting more advanced in your career and you really have a hand in doing the business development or building your firm, right? If the cost of having that client is you can never do any of the strategic work you need to do, does that cost even make sense if that was really even true? So there's a lot of different ways to come at it, but basically what you have to do is come up with a thought that feels better that you can believe. And the way you know that is you just practice thinking it. So you say it to yourself. So you say to yourself, like, this isn't an emergency, and clients understand that it might take an hour to get back to them. And then you just see how that feels. If you feel just as anxious, then that thought isn't really going to work for you. You got to try another one. It's a very individualized process. So the best thing you can do if you're not working with a coach is just experiment a lot. Like, just brainstorm a bunch of different sentences you could maybe say about the scenario and go through them and see if any of them help you feel better.
And I think anytime when you're trying something new and you don't get like immediate relief, you're like, oh, that doesn't work for me. So I do think that if you're trying to do this work, it does help to work with someone that can give you feedback and help you pivot along the way. So let's talk about, all right, so we were talking about how do you deal with the thoughts related to, is this an emergency or not? Why am I stuck in this quadrant? But let's go up to the planning one where it's like, okay, I don't have a deadline right now. And so I'm going to procrastinate and avoid it. But then there's going to be a deadline. And then suddenly it moves into the second quadrant, which is now it's an emergency. And so now I have to get it done. I loved, and I encourage everyone to go listen to the first episode of Kara's podcast on procrastination. But can you briefly kind of give us an overview of the evolution of the brain and the fight or flight and kind of what's going on with the procrastination versus what happens when you actually have a deadline looming over your head?
Yeah, totally. So the 2-second evolutionary biology is that your brain evolved to keep your body alive and it doesn't care how you feel. So it evolved to be terrified of danger, right? So if you're going to be eaten by a lion, your brain is like, good, I want you to feel anxious, run, right? That's the fight or flight. And that's the feeling of anxiety you get. Anxiety is actually physical sensations in your body that are caused by physiological processes that actually make you better able to like run away or fight. So you get tense because your muscles tense up so you can run faster. You breathe more shallowly, so you get more oxygen in your blood. So that's what happens when you experience danger is you feel anxiety. Now, most of us are not being chased by lions. And so the danger is our thoughts about the project. So let's say you're trying to work on a big, ambitious thing, right? You're trying to move your career forward strategically. You have a project you want to do. But you also have a whole bunch of unconscious thoughts that you're probably not aware of that are like, what if I screw this up? It's going to be humiliating. I can't do this. No one's ever tried to do something like this before. No one's going to respect my efforts, right? Whatever it is you're thinking, which is usually some version of I'm going to fail or I'm going to look stupid. You're having those thoughts about your project. Those thoughts create anxiety for you. So one of the reasons that lawyers live in the urgent quadrant is they want to live there because it's scary to deal with the stuff in number one. That's why we're not doing it, right? When we think about number one, we feel like we want to procrastinate and avoid. The secret that coaching teaches you is that it's not the project, like it's not sort of mysterious. You're having a thought about the project or the consequence of the project, and that thought is producing anxiety for you. So if your thought is, I'm going to fail at this, you feel anxious, then you avoid doing the project. What happens with a deadline is basically that the object of your terror changes from the project to the deadline. So when you are procrastinating, the project makes you anxious, and so you do whatever you can to avoid it. Like the project is the lion, and your brain is like, run away from the lion, so ignore the project. Mm-hmm. Once the deadline gets close enough, the thing you're terrified of is missing the deadline. And so in that situation, the way to quote-unquote get away from the deadline is to actually do the work. Or to ask for an extension, which also people do, right? I mean, we did that in school, and even in work, sometimes you're feeling really anxious. You're like, I don't have enough time. That thought makes you anxious. And then you solve it by emailing someone and being like, listen, can I get this to you Thursday instead? And then all of a sudden you feel better because you've moved the thing you're scared of, the deadline, farther away. Then you can go back to procrastinating more until it gets to be Wednesday, right? And the process repeats all over again.
But it creates so much unneeded stress.
So much. Yeah, you can just change your thought and then you don't have to go through any of that. It's so much easier.
Okay, so I'm going to admit that I've really been struggling with my website. Now, this is one where it is important and there is no deadline. I mean, there are deadlines, but they're self-imposed deadlines, so they're not real. That lion is never going to chase me, right? So I started working on this in maybe February or March. We made good progress, and then there were like a lot of moving pieces that were then on my shoulders. And I have been holding things up for a good 6 to 8 weeks. I'm just now starting to hire people out. But I mean, are you willing to help me out?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. So
let's talk through it.
The more specific, the better. So tell me a specific thing you're supposed to be doing for the website that you have been ignoring.
Okay. So writing copy for a few different pages. I will tell you, I have now hired a copywriter, but we can still go through this issue because that's part of it. It was 1, writing the copy, and 2, picking out pictures to go with the copy.
Okay. Are you still supposed to pick out the pictures, or do you hire that out also?
I still have some work to do on that.
Okay, so let's do that one because you actually have to do it as opposed to the copywriting you've temporarily solved for yourself.
Okay.
So you're supposed to pick out photos. How do you feel when you think about picking out the photos?
Oh, right. Okay. So at first I get excited because I'm like, ooh, pretty photos. I get to pick pretty photos. But then it's this fear of you're not going to be able to find pretty photos, like because you're not a designer and you have something in mind that you want, but you don't know how to actually go get it. And the other thought, I guess, is anytime I go to, websites, where I'm going to like buy the photos, I can spend hours on there and I don't feel productive. And then I just feel exhausted and defeated and depleted.
Okay. So you have a couple of different thoughts going on. So one of them is you're not going to be able to find pretty photos, right? And when you think that, how do you feel?
I'm a perfectionist. So it's like, I don't want to put out a website that doesn't have pretty photos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your brain, you can see the progression here. Your brain is like, you won't be able to find them. Then you'll have to put out a website that looks terrible. We don't want to do that. So let's just not start the process at all.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what we would want to do is work on, I think there's two things going on here. So one of them is we can work on the thoughts you have about starting the task. Ultimately, there's also this issue of the perfectionism, right? And you are what I call, I don't know if you're familiar with this framework, but there's two decision-making styles. One is being a satisficer and one is being a maximizer. Mm-hmm. And so satisficers may have a stringent set of criteria, but as soon as they see something that meets the criteria, they're fine. So like, that's what I'm like. When I go to look at photos for something, I have something in mind I want, but the minute I see a photo that seems good enough, I'm like, great, done.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like you may be a maximizer where you want to find the perfect thing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like you think there's one that's better than all the rest and you can't rest until you've seen them all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's going to be an ongoing, like bigger picture thing for you in your life, but I think it's impacting here. So tell me what would happen. What would be so terrible if you picked some photos that weren't perfect for your website?
Okay, so if I'm being realistic, what's going to happen is they just go on my website and it's still better than the one I have now because it's going to more accurately reflect where I am in my business right now. So I can logically...
But that's not what you really believe. Tell me what you really believe.
What do I really believe? What I really believe is that it's going to reflect on me poorly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the question here for you is you're trying to manage what other people think about your website. So what percentage do you think you can manage other people's thoughts?
What percentage can I manage other people's thoughts?
Yeah.
0. I know that.
Right.
But it doesn't change the fact that I still think subconsciously that I can control this.
Right. So what's going on? You have a very high level of awareness, right? So what I would work on with you and what I think would be the best for you is some people are unaware of their thoughts. I think you're aware of them. But you have to consciously practice thinking different thoughts, right? So for instance, right now you have this thought, I'm not going to be able to find what I want. So do you believe the thought or could you believe the thought, if I look, it's possible I'll find a good photo?
That would be a great way to reframe it because I sit down assuming I'm not going to find a good one.
Right. And then of course you don't because you don't look. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a perfect example of the model. It's like the circumstance is just you're going to look for a photo. Your thought is I'm not going to find one. Then you feel anxious. So you don't even look. You avoid looking. And of course the result is you didn't find one. And then your brain gets to say to you, I mean, you've been looking for 6 months and still haven't found one. Obviously there isn't one. Right? When like you haven't really been looking for most of that time.
Yeah. Okay. So what about the times when I do sit down to look and it takes me a long time? Should I be saying something positive to myself before I even get started so that I am open to more possibilities as opposing to looking for bad photos? Because sometimes I think that's what happens.
Yeah. If you sit down and think, your brain will absolutely find evidence of whatever you tell it. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with this experiment, but my favorite psychology experiment is the experiment where you show somebody a video and you ask them to count the dribbles. There's people playing basketball. You ask them to count the dribbles. People count the dribbles and no one even sees that in the middle of the experiment, a guy in a gorilla suit walks across the frame.
Oh yeah, I've seen that. I love it.
Yeah. I've had it done to me and I totally did not see it. Right? Your brain looks for what you tell it to look for. It has to, because your brain takes in so much information all the time, right? Otherwise you could never leave the house because every time it'd be like, oh my God, that's a door. What's a door? What's happening? Right? Or like you don't see your nose. Your eyes actually take in information that your nose is there, but your brain filters it out of your view because it would be distracting. So your brain looks for what you tell it to look for. If you sit down and think, I'm not going to find a good photo, you won't even see the ones that might be good, right? It's like when I work with people on dating. It's like if your thoughts are, there's nobody for me to meet, every date you go on is going to be terrible, right? Because that's what you're expecting to find. So that's what you look for evidence of. So yeah, for you, I think if you think, how do you feel when you think, if I look, it's possible I'll find one?
Yeah, that feels much better.
Yeah. So if you practice that thought before you sit down, I think number one, you'll start looking faster. I mean, you'll start looking in the first place. But I think also you'll be more open to what you see, right? Because if your thought is like, there are a lot of great photos out there, I'm sure I'll find one that works. You're totally going to find one in the first hour. Okay.
So I'm totally doing this. I'm knocking this out. By the way, yes. I'm going on vacation in a few days and I've got a full
before then. I'm going to ping you on tomorrow and be like, did you find that photo?
I'm doing it. I'm totally doing it. Okay. I love this. So tell me, all right, for my listeners that are interested in this, how do you work with people?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I have the podcast, which is a great way to kind of learn a little bit more about me and my work. But then I also take private clients. And right now I'm actually filling a small group, which I'm super excited about, which is going to be called the Lawyer Stress Solution Small Group Edition. Sounds very lawyerly and formal. But it's not. It's just a super fun, small group way of learning this work. And it's starting September 11th, actually. So the best way if people want to find out more about that is they can just go to www.thelawyer-stress-solution, same as the name of the podcast, Lawyer Stress Solution, and then /small group. So it's a 6-week group. We're going to have live coaching calls, which will be recorded in case anyone misses anything. And what I do is I teach you this model that I just used with Heather. So I teach you how to do for yourself what I just did with Heather. And obviously I coach you along the way also as you're getting better at doing it for yourself. And so by the end of the 6 weeks, you know how to reduce your anxiety at work, you know how to be more productive and more efficient, and you know how to feel more optimistic about your life and you feel better about yourself, which is what it really all comes down to.
And this is open for men and women.
Yes, it is open for men and women. I would say the majority of my clients tend to be women, but certainly I have male clients also.
Awesome. So this is perfect timing because I think everybody kind of relaxes a little bit in the summer with their vacations, and then the kids get back into school and everything's into full swing and you're trying to hit those year-end numbers. So this is perfect timing.
Yeah, help you ease the transition back to real life.
Yeah, and manage that stress before you even get to the holidays. Wonderful. We will put that link in the show notes as well. So if you missed it, you can just head to the show notes and we will have that link there for you, both with the podcast and with that small group. Okay, so if it starts, you said September 11th?
Yep, I'm taking registrations until it fills up. I like to keep the numbers small. So check it out on the site, and people can always email me if they have questions. There's a contact form there too.
Okay, so there's no deadline to sign up, but it's first come, first serve. So if you don't get in there now, you might shut it down.
Exactly. I would expect it'll fill up by the beginning of September. So now's a good time to get going.
Okay. Well, this is being released, I think, on the 22nd. So if you are interested in this, get on it this week. No procrastinating.
Exactly. Whatever your thought is about it, check in with that. Exactly. You want a good thought.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, this has been amazing. I am so glad that you came on. You've helped me, and I will check back in with everybody on how that went. And maybe I can just go ahead and give you the link to the new website. That would be
exactly. That's what I was going to say. On your next podcast, I want to hear the website is done and up. Everybody check it out.
Yes. Okay. Well, probably won't be the next one because I've already pre-recorded it because guys, I'm going on vacation. You got to prepare for these things.
Yeah.
But 2 from now, I'm absolutely going to be announcing my website, and I'm confident that I will do that. Thanks to Kara. All right. This has been so much fun. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And I can't wait to hear how my listeners sign up for your small group course and provide feedback.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kara.
Bye.
For show notes, downloads, and other free resources, and to keep the conversation going, head on over to hustleandflowpodcast.com. See you there.